In today's video, you're going to see Magnus Carlsen sacrifice not one, not two, but three entire pieces within the space of only 4 moves in order to force a savage checkmate that's among the coolest that you'll ever see. It features a stunning and very useful tactical pattern that's one of my all-time favorites, and it's one that you're going to want to burn deep into your chess psyche so that you can use it in your very own games. And trust me, if you play long enough, you definitely will. Now, after we look at that game, as if it's not enough on its own, I'm going to be showing you another Magnus masterpiece, this one against a much stronger opponent, but once again, you're going to see him go into full sacrificial rampage mode, ridding himself of nearly his entire army in order to force another spectacular mate that you won't soon forget. So buckle up, these games are intense, especially this first one, which I found particularly fascinating because it gives us a rare glimpse into what can happen when Magnus is up against your average non-titled chess player. Now, I realize that I do have viewers of all different rating levels, but for a good many of you watching, what you're about to see is probably very similar to what you could expect to happen if you were to play Magnus Carlsen yourself, since his opponent is not of world-class strength or likely anywhere near it. The game is from a series of 10 that Magnus played against anonymous opponents on chess.com in late 2024, all having a username beginning with Julius Baer. Now, try as I might, I couldn't find any concrete info on exactly who these players are, but my guess is that they're either employees, clients, or VIPs of some sort affiliated with the private banking company Julius Baer that has been sponsoring the Champions Chess Tour. So let's see what Magnus is able to do to your run-of-the-mill person who knows how to play chess. He's got the white pieces in this first game, and he opens with d4. His opponent, Julius Baer 11, responds knight to f6. We have knight to c3, and now e6, inviting Magnus to set up his ideal central duo with e4 and supporting black's next move, d5. When after e5, the opening has transposed into a classical French defense, more specifically the Steinitz variation. Black retreats his attack knight to d7, at which point we get a slightly unusual move from Magnus, knight c to e2. Much more common here is f4, supporting white's proudest pawn on e5, but this anti-developing move is played in anticipation of c5, now played by black, as it clears the way for Magnus's next move, c3, supporting the pawn on d4 and preparing to replace it with another pawn if and when it is captured, thereby maintaining defense of e5. So it's all about the health of the white pawn structure here. Black continues with another strong move, knight to c6. f4 is still very playable, but Magnus instead opts for piece development with knight to f3. Next we have queen to b6, just increasing the pressure on d4, eyeballing b2. Black is playing very well so far, and we're still in pretty well-known opening territory. Magnus continues with the top book move, a3, supporting a possible b4, as well as keeping black's bishop out of that square after c takes d4 and white recaptures with the c pawn. And this exchange in the center would be decent for black here. f6 is playable as well, but instead we have a6, which despite looking a bit passive is actually not too bad according to the engine, which is giving a crazy variation that we're not going to get into, but I will tell you that it begins with the move b4 by white and includes an eventual bishop to b5 check, a move that would be winning if black's pawn were not guarding that square. So if you want to play detective and try to guess how that line goes, have at it. It is pretty nuts, and I doubt that black calculated any of it during the game. I'm guessing he's just concerned about a pawn making its way to b5, attacking his knight, so he wants to add some coverage to that square. Magnus now puts his knight on f4, disincentivizing any f6 to attack his structure further, as that would now lose a pawn on e6. So we have bishop to e7, and what do you suppose the top engine move is here? What move do engines always love to play? h4, of course. It's not worried about weakening the king side a tad, since most of black's pieces are sitting over here on the queen side. Maybe that h-pawn will forage further with disruptive intentions if and when the time is right, or maybe it'll just stay where it is, preventing any g5 from black to kick white's knight off of its best good post. And that's actually what black should have tried to play while he had the chance. Instead of bishop to e7, the engine was recommending c takes d4 followed by an immediate g5, sacrificing the pawn to knight takes g5 in order to remove a defender from d4, where black would then get his pawn back. But here, white's just got a much better position. Apparently black's best chance now is to play queen to a5, discouraging an immediate b4, as that would lose a pawn due to the pin on the a-pawn. But black, in a blissful state of oblivion, which is always the best kind, After capturing on d4 and Magnus recaptures with the pawn, now thinks that he's all good to just castle on the king side. Not a very good idea, seeing that after Magnus's top engine response, bishop to d3, he's got the majority of his pieces trained on that side of the board, while most of black's pieces are chilling over here on the queen side, in flagrant dereliction of their kingside guarding duty. In other words, the black king is feeling a bit lonely and exposed. The engine is recommending f5 here, which may or may not help you guess what white should play after black's next move, f6. Pause the video if you'd like to try and spot white's most crushing move. It's not super obvious, so don't feel bad if you didn't find it, because Magnus didn't play it either. But what white should play is knight to g5, threatening checkmate in 2 moves with bishop takes h7 check, followed by knight to g6. Now the obvious question is what happens if black takes the knight? Well, in that case, white would gain a massive advantage with the move that Magnus actually played in the game instead of an immediate knight to g5, which is bishop takes h7. So we're not going to look at that line just yet, as it does transpose to what was played in the game. But what we need to know here is what happens if black just lets the knight stay on g5. Okay, you got to defend against mate. You can try f5, but then the e6 pawn falls, and you got nothing but a dead lost position. You can try g6, blocking the diagonal that way, keeping the counter pressure on e5, but now comes knight takes g6, and the black king's flimsy pawn cover is just getting annihilated. He's got a number of things he can try, no time to cover them all. I'll just show you one of the engine's favorite ways to lose, which goes as follows. F takes g5, knight takes e7 check, knight takes e7, and now bishop takes h7 check. When one way or another, the white queen is going to be coming into h5, and or the pawn on g5 is going to be captured, bringing to life the rook on h1, and very bad things are going to happen. So just to give you an idea, we might as well look at the obvious king takes bishop, when after h takes g5 check, king to g7, and queen to h5, black is facing a forced mate in 20 moves according to our infallible silicon seer. So I'll just go ahead and show it in fast motion here, just for posterity's sake. As you can see, the black king gets driven all the way to the other side of the board and is eventually cornered and captured by the enemy queen. Okay, we did our due diligence, or at least that's what we're going to tell ourselves, as we get right back to the game. Where in response to f6, Magnus Carlsen does correctly conclude that he can now win the game by sacrificing multiple pieces, but he begins with the wrong one, playing an immediate bishop takes h7 check. So, how is this different from the winning line that we just looked at beginning with knight to g5? Well, after king takes h7 and knight to g5 check, now played by Magnus, instead of capturing the knight, as his blunderous opponent does, black can simply put his king back on g8. Now if knight takes e6 is played here, then he can counter by taking on e5, hitting the knight on f4 with a winning position for black, if you can believe that, and I hope that you do, since I have no desire to try and prove it. What I want to look at is the correct move, queen to h5, threatening checkmate in 1. Now black is able to take the knight on g5, since after h takes g5, black has a single saving move in this position. Care to guess what it is? It's queen takes d4, when after g6, queen takes e5 with check would force the trade of queens, and white's attack is pretty much over. So here, white has nothing better than to force a draw by repetition with queen to h7 check, king to f7, queen to h5 check, king to g8, queen to h7 check, etc. Okay, let's contrast this with what was played in the game, which in response to Magnus's knight to g5 is the horrendously blunderous f takes g5. Magnus, of course, recaptures with the pawn, with check, the king goes back to g8, and what do you think the move is now? It's white to play and win. Pause the video and see what you can come up with. Well, you know it's not queen to h5, because that would just transpose into the line that we already looked at, where black plays queen takes d4, and it's a draw. The stunning move, now played by Magnus, and one that you're going to want to commit to memory, is rook to h8 check. Queen to h5 is going to be winning, but only if it comes with check. Now if the king runs to f7, then queen to h5 forces mate in another 2 moves, so you got to try king takes h8, but after queen to h5 with check, king to g8, and g6, queen takes d4 is no longer going to save black, and neither is anything else. The engine's saying that he should sacrifice both his bishop and his rook so that his king has somewhere to run. Not that he's going to be very safe on those dark squares with white's bishop coming into g5, so there will likely need to be more sacrifices made. I'm seeing some knight takes e5 being recommended by Stockfish a little ways down that line. There doesn't seem to be a checkmate by force on the horizon just yet, but between black's chronically vulnerable king and white's soon-to-be passed pawn on g6, after the white queen picks off the pawn on g7, it'll pretty much be curtains for Team Black. So it would have been interesting to see how things played out if black had defended like an engine, but what we have instead is a move that makes life extremely easy for Magnus Carlsen, rook to f5, allowing him to force mate in 2 moves with queen to h7 check, king to f8, and queen to h8 checkmate. So how brutal was that? Not something you get to see too often from Magnus Carlsen. When he's playing his more typical opponents of super GM level strength, it's very easy to forget that such swift and savage sacrificial annihilations may be lurking under the surface amidst the unplayed sidelines. But even at the elite level, such combinations do sometimes rear their terrifying heads, as is the case in our next game. Played in mid-2005 when the 14-year-old Magnus Carlsen was still relatively new to his grandmasterly status, having held the title for about a year. His opponent is a 20-year-old Norwegian international master by the name of Geir Ustmu. Magnus is in command of the Bleached Brigade, and he opens with knight to f3. Geir responds symmetrically with knight to f6. Magnus thrusts a pawn to c4, transposing into an English opening, as indicated by the lat long of this Atlantic pawn. We have e6, freeing the DSB, d4, transposing into an East Indian defense. Black has a number of playable options here. He could thrust forth in the center himself with d5, deliver a check with bishop to b4, or play the move now chosen by Geir, b6, activating his other bishop. Magnus replies with the move most preferred by both grandmasters and chess engines alike, seeing that he belongs to both categories, g3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g2, where it has the potential to help contest black's control of the light squares, which would only increase if black were to now play bishop to b7, but instead we have the popular alternative, bishop to a6, targeting the pawn on c4. The timing of which is of course no accident, seeing that the natural-looking e3 defending with the light-squared bishop would no longer make any sense as that bishop has been already committed elsewhere. So the booked-up young Magnus responds with a much more theoretically sound b3 defending with the pawn, while preparing a possible bishop fianchetto number 2, and now we get a move that's a tad unusual, b5. What can we say about this? Well, it threatens to win the pawn on c4, which white doesn't have a super convenient way to defend. There's queen to c2, but then you can't develop your knight to its best good c3 square without blocking the defense. Defending with knight to d2 is not compatible with the knight to c3 plan either, for reasons I hope are fairly obvious, but there is another option, c takes b5, now played by Magnus. When after the bishop recaptures, it is true that white has given up a key central influencing pawn for a less central pawn of black's, but what he gains in return is a nice lead in development. You'll notice that black has expended 2 moves in order to achieve this exchange of pawns, b5 and bishop takes b5, while white has only expended 1 move, c takes b5. Additionally, knight to c3 will now be coming with the tempo on black's bishop. Magnus doesn't play it right away though. He wants to get his king castled first so that there's no bishop to b4 pinning his knight to his king, hence the move bishop to g2. Geir now hits the hot zone with d5, Magnus castles, a knight's developed to d7, supporting a possible c5. Looks very right and natural. Here comes knight to c3, giving a prod to black's white-haired cleric. It scampers to a6 with an alarming level of energy, not unlike my ex-roommate who had a tendency to overclean the house for no apparent reason. Not that that necessarily bothered me, but there were some other issues as well. Anyway, Magnus puts a rook on e1, supporting a future e4. We have bishop to d6, getting lined up on white's rock-solid g3 pawn. The engine liked bishop to e7 just a hair better, which probably has something to do with the fact that it now likes bishop to g5, just a hair better than the move Magnus plays, bishop to b2, placing the bishop on a pretty dismal-looking diagonal, blocked by a friendly pawn. But not to worry, you know Magnus has a plan, and after Geir castles, we see that it involves the move e4, threatening e5 with a fork. So black's definitely going to want to capture that pawn, but how to do it? Would you take with the pawn or with the knight? Or does it even matter? Well, yes it does. If you take with the pawn, white can play knight to g5 and then recapture with the knight, defended by another knight. After what's played in the game, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and d takes e4, knight to g5 is no longer an option, as the black queen has that square covered. Knight to d2 is no good either, since black could then just defend his pawn with f5. So we have the necessary recapture by the rook. White now has an isolated pawn on d4, but with the elimination of black's pawn on d5, there's now the prospect of activating the bishop on b2 with a timely d5. Geyer's hip to white's plan though, and he responds with a very good move, bishop to b7, guarding d5 with an attack on white's rook. And where do you think Magnus puts that rook? Here's a clue. It's probably the most cavemanly move on the board. Rook to h4. When in doubt, plan for drought. Or get your pieces out and point them in the direction of your opponent's king. Now for any of you who may be new to chess, or just new to playing chess well, this is not typically known to be a very good way to develop your rook, leaving it stranded out in the front lines like this where it may be subject to attack by pieces and pawns of lesser value. It's a very risky thing to do, and Magnus's rook does indeed come under immediate fire with Geyer's response bishop to e7. Now the engine is recommending rook to f4 here, probably just to maintain some flexibility and its view of the center, but Magnus now doubles down on his kingside attack with rook to h3. So he's pretty much committed to making some magic happen on that h7 square, otherwise this rook is just going to be terribly misplaced, being sidelined over here on the edge of the board. Geyer puts his knight on f6, adding defense to h7, makes a lot of sense. Magnus develops his queen to e2, a good square where it won't be harassed by black's knight or bishop coming into e4. We now have a very strong move by Geyer, bishop to d5, and what do you think the main point of this move is? Well, it does clear the b file for one of black's heavy pieces, but more importantly, it prevents white from sacrificing a pawn on d5 in order to activate that lurking bishop on b2, which at this moment doesn't seem to have much future. The engine is actually slightly preferring black now, and it's recommending white play knight to e5 with the idea of hopping into c6, but after Magnus's rather passive rook to e1, if black were to now play a5, planning a4 next to try and open the file and activate his rook, then he would enjoy an even greater advantage, maybe even close to winning. But Geyer now returns the favor with the passive move of his own, queen to b8. Okay, it's not completely without purpose. There is the idea of queen to b7, ramping up the pressure on the long diagonal, but after knight to e5, now played by Magnus, queen to b7, bishop takes d5, and the queen recaptures, the engine is now cheering for Team White, and recommending the move now played by Magnus, queen to c2. Is he looking to pick up that undefended pawn on c7? Negative. If black were to continue with his strongest move, a5, again looking for a4, then queen takes c7 could be met with bishop to b4 with tempo on the rook, threatening rook a to c8, attacking the queen, followed by an infiltration to c2. Now white can prevent that by playing rook to c1, but then the engine really likes knight to e4. We're not going to concern ourselves with that though, because all we really need to know is that Magnus is fixated on that h7 square. He's still got to try to justify his oddly placed rook over here on h3, which after the blunderous c5 is suddenly going to be a whole lot easier to do. And the reason is that he now has a powerful winning move at his disposal. Pause the video if you'd like to try and spot it. White's winning move? Well, one of his winning moves is knight to g4. The other is actually knight to c6, which on the surface just looks like it loses a piece. But let me know in the comments if you can see what the point of that move is. Anyway, in this position, white is threatening to eliminate the knight on f6, which is providing essential defense to h7. So no knight takes g4 here, as that would just hang checkmate in one move. Something's got to be done about the threat of knight takes knight, followed by queen takes h7. You might be tempted to play g6 just to block the diagonal, but this leaves the dark squares very weak, allowing the knight into h6 with check, and then after d takes c5, activating the sniper on b2. Black's imminent judgment for his unpardonable kingside transgressions will be swift and severe, the gory details of which I'm going to have to leave to your imagination as we take a look at Black's most resilient response, not played in the game, h5. When after knight takes f6 check, we get to see the problem with Black having played this move c5. If he recaptures on f6 with the pawn, maintaining its defense with his bishop, well, now his king is exposed, and white can follow up with queen to e2, targeting the pawn on h5, which black has no way to save. The better move, bishop takes f6, also runs into big trouble though after d takes c5 when if black were to try bishop takes b2, so that after queen takes b2 he could regain the pawn with queen takes c5. Well, here we have rook to e5 defended by the queen with rook takes pawn on h5 coming next, and black is pretty much hosed, being a pawn down and facing the doubled rooks on his opened h-file, ready to penetrate his king's crumbling castle. This would have been significantly better than what was tried in the game though, where after knight to g4, Geyer decides to push his pawn to h6. So how is this worse than playing h5? Well, I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count. Magnus has a couple of winning moves in this position. Doesn't matter a whole lot which one he plays first. He begins with rook to e5, attacking the black queen, which flees to f3. Might as well try to stay close to the king side, but now it's time for Magnus to exercise the nuclear option with his only winning move. Pause if you're partial to pondering the position, but here it comes. Knight takes h6 check. Okay, first things first. What if the king moves? Well, here it's mate in 3 with knight to g4 discovered check, king to g8, knight takes f6 check, bishop takes f6, and queen to h7 checkmate. So instead, we do have the obvious recapture. Magnus follows up with rook takes h6, now threatening rook to g5 checkmate. Hence the move king to g7, preparing to meet rook to g5 with king takes rook on h6 with a winning position for black. One would think, but are you ready to see something really beautiful? You're not going to believe this, but you should because I very rarely lie. Magnus plays rook to g5 check anyway, sacrificing piece number 2 to king takes h6. Is he of sound mind? How could this possibly work? Well, white has but one way to vindicate his sacrificial aggression, and that is with the powerful and quite insidious bishop to c1, threatening a devastating discovered check, which black has no good way to prevent. He can't attack the bishop on c1, his king has no moves, and the only way he can block the diagonal is with his queen, which is going to be necessary after rook to g4 check, seeing that king to h5 would run into rook to h4 mate. So one way or another, black is going to be losing his queen here, whether to rook to g4 check or rook to f5 check, depending on what he plays. Geyer decides to go for c takes d4, which is actually the top choice of the engine. The point of this move being that after rook to g4, discovered check, now played by Magnus, Geyer is now able to block with queen to e3, defended by a pawn, thus enabling him to meet bishop takes e3 check with d takes e3, as opposed to king to h5, allowing that rook to h4 checkmate. Now in this position, I think that many a weak to moderate player would be tempted to just capture the black queen, but this would be a grave error, since if you do it with the bishop, then you lose the bishop to d takes e3, and if you do it with the pawn, then you lose a whole rook to knight takes g4. White is significantly down in material, so there is the danger of giving black sufficient material compensation for his lost queen. So white needs to hang on to as much material as possible here. After all, chess is a game of greed, and as such, it's a great little microcosm for the economics of free market capitalism, or a good substitute for it, depending on your ideology. What's played by Magnus is the only winning move in the position, rook to h4 check. Geyer blocks with the knight. It is the best defense as it uncovers an attack on that rook, so black's at least going to be getting another exchange out of the deal. Now moving the rook somewhere like h3 or e4 might look tempting for a hot minute until you realize that black can begin to complicate matters with rook a to c8 counterattacking white's queen. So what Magnus plays is the strongest move on the board, rook takes knight on h5. It does come with check, and after king takes h5, we now have queen to h7 check, forcing the king to either g5 or g4. Which square is better? Well, they're both equally losing, so it doesn't really matter. What's tried is king to g4, maybe just instinctively avoiding the dark squares to stay out of the view of white's bishop. We now finally have the capture of the black queen, with the pawn of course, at which point, if black wanted to prolong his misery for as long as possible, then he'd play something like bishop to g5, with the idea of capturing the pawn on e3. White would then have a number of crushing options, the simplest of which, but by no means the strongest, is probably queen to e4 check, followed by queen takes pawn on d4, when white's extra pawns and black's still hideously vulnerable king leave little doubt as to the outcome of the game. But what's tried is rook a to c8, attacking the bishop on c1. Looks pretty reasonable, but this gives Magnus a stunning opportunity to demonstrate why he holds the title of chess grandmaster and future title of chess goat. Are you ready for this? It is a sacrifice of yet another piece with king to g2. Now the best way for black to delay mate here is going to be with rook to g8 to prevent queen to g7 check. Of course, after white's best response, e takes d4, there will be no rook takes bishop on c1, or else the rook on g8 falls. So that's quite hopeless for black. But what's played in the game is the obvious rook takes bishop on c1, allowing Magnus to execute a beautiful checkmate in 4 moves. Try to work it out on your own if you'd like, but here it comes, beginning with h3 check. King to g5 is black's only move. Next is queen to g7 check. If king to h5, then g4 check, followed by queen to h6 will be mate. So we have king to f5, so that after g4 check, the king is able to run to e4. And you remember how I mentioned earlier that black should try to play bishop to g5 and then bishop takes e3? Well, now we get to see why that would have been useful, since without this pawn on e3, Magnus would not be able to play his final move of the game, queen takes d4 check and mate. So what a masterclass that was on how to sacrifice nearly all your pieces in order to deliver a stunning and relatively rare middle of the board mate using only queen, king, and pawns. This is why Magnus Carlsen is a legend. We don't get to see this kind of sacrificial brilliance as often as we would if he were to go back to playing non-Super GM opponents on a regular basis. So that's why it's always nice to revisit some of these old masterpieces. But give me all of your thoughts on these 2 incredible games in the comments. Consider subscribing to the channel to see more content like this on a regular basis. Hit the like button if you like chess or anything else, and I will see you soon.